Hey, Tim, I was just looking over our selected topic for today. Oh my goodness. So let me first of all begin this way. I came out of retirement, not as a full-time consultant again, but more along the lines of advisory and project management issues and that sort of thing. And I got thrown to the deep end on an Agile project.
Ooh.
Yeah. And you know me, I mean, we've been talking on this podcast for months now about how all of my past experience is much more in the predictive, certainly almost exclusively tied to waterfall methodologies. And so I'm very comfortable in that realm, but I'm also finding this fascinating. And so I thought what we might do today, I noticed that this is kind of like Agile Part 2, I think is what we named it.
Hmm.
I thought what we might do today is me act more of, maybe it's like the no, not the Johnny Carson. He was funny, but kind of like the MC, where I ask questions and provide color commentary, and we just kind of give our audience a flavor for maybe some of the history of Agile, maybe how it's used, maybe a little comparison here and there to predictive. Last week we discussed a lot of concepts. This week, let's kind of get into some of the terminology and some of that. How's that?
Yeah, that's great. And we'll talk about some of these tools too.
Oh, good. So just from let's kind of last week, as I mentioned, was concepts. So let's kind of get a little bit into a definition, perhaps, of Agile, and maybe a little bit of the historical context behind this. I mean, without going all the way back to Plato.
Right, right, right.
There's some historical context that we can kind of launch this podcast from. How's that?
That'd be great. So let's talk about this from a big picture standpoint.
Perfect.
Now, when we started with Agile, it was probably back in the 1970s and 1980s. We were talking about the fact that projects were getting really complex. And then as we got into big software development projects, it was like, we don't even know where to stop and start. And we have to wrap our heads around this. And so back in about 1980 to 1984, a guy by the name of Brooks, who was the project manager of, I believe, the IBM 360 operating system, created a book, a wonderful book called The Mythical Man Month, and you can still get it. You can even find it on PDF online for free. It's a brilliant recap of all the problems they had trying to understand and manage developing this huge monolithic operating system. Out of it, we got the theory of constraints.
Mhm.
Out of it, we got the fact that you can't just put a bunch of engineers in a room and tell them to do work. That's just not the way it works, because
Wasn't that the story where if a woman, and I don't want to sound sexist about this, but basically biologically, if a woman can create another person, have a baby in 9 months, you cannot have 9 women create that same baby in 1 month. That isn't that, wasn't
yeah,
that part of his theory?
that's part of it. It's the nature of the work. And the
Yeah.
problem is, he found out that so many parts of the project and management of the project were, if you start working with it, it got sticky and it
Yeah.
stuck to you, and you get stuck down in these details where you needed to step at a higher level. And out of that grew a lot of understandings. Now, at the same time, this is what's wild. It's like watching those old Carl Sagan movies, Cosmos, right? Because he tracks this thread and this thread and this, and this is the same thing that's happening, because you had W.E. Deming, who went out to Japan after World War II, and he was working on quality. Now, what does quality have to do with Agile? There's something they learned out in Japan called lean. And if you think about quality, or part of quality, as removing defects, lean says waste is a defect you can continuously improve on and remove. And so lean was actually making things efficient and making things clean. And out of tracking that, out of tracking these guys who are doing big software development releases, you start getting this understanding of we got to figure out to do this work differently. It just cannot be done the way these monolithic projects have been done in the past. So about early 1990s, you get the idea that a bunch of people were working at the same time. There was a couple guys, Schwaber and Sutherland, who created something called Scrum. And Scrum is not necessarily a project management methodology. It's what they call a framework. And a framework is basically a set of tools and processes. It's sort of like a bunch of systems that you can work together. And it includes a mindset. It includes servant leadership, self-organizing teams, reviews, retrospectives, all these things that we think of as Agile.
Does Scrum stand for anything like SCRUM, or is
It
it just...
actually came from from an understanding of Australian football.
Okay.
It's basically how do we get the ball back in play? And
Well,
everybody's
having
huh?
watched Australian rules football, there was no servant leadership in that game.
No, but what you have is self-organizing teams.
Yes. Sorry, I
And
didn't mean to interrupt. It
oh,
was
no.
curiosity.
This is what it's all about.
Yeah.
So you have that going in, right? And so we start developing all of these other ideas, like let's see here, 1996 we have extreme programming, which starts playing with self-empowered teams. See, we're trying to actually insert accountability and responsibility into the teams so they can directly interact with the stakeholders, the experts who own the expertise and the stakeholders who own the needs. If we can just get them to talk together. And this is what lean and Scrum and extreme programming we're all trying to do. And coming together here in about 2001, we have something called the Agile Alliance. All these guys were doing all the similar thing. They were solving the same problem, but they were calling these things different terms. And so they decided with the Agile Alliance to come to agreement with, here's the problem we're trying to solve, and here's the set of terms that we're going to use. And that's basically what it became. And we started off with the term adaptive, which comes from complex systems, the science of complex systems, which means self-organizing. And under that, they applied iterative, the repeating process nature of Agile projects, incremental, being able to deliver throughout the project life cycle, and Agile itself, which directly addresses these things like uncertainty and complexity and major change.
So let's see
go
if
ahead.
I can kind of paint this from my own perspective, because I'm understanding, or I believe I'm understanding, but certainly the whole idea of bringing in the customer or the end product user with a developer makes sense. Because I remember when I started my career and worked my way up through the programming ranks to analysis to design to becoming a project manager. Back then, and I can say back then because you mentioned OS 360, Brooks operating system, that was the first operating system that I worked on.
Wow.
But back then, it seemed to me that we as the IT people were looked upon as these brainiacs, and whatever we produced and gave to our end users, they needed to use it. So we were basically the ones who controlled the process and basically said, here, this is your new system, use it. And we trained them a little bit.
And whenever you get that point, there's a Latin word that starts tapping you on the shoulder. It's called hubris.
Yeah. But I think that's the way it was. I think the users, this new computer thing kind of mesmerized everybody as some sort of magic or cult practice or something that us smart people could only do. And so therefore they acquiesced to what we did. Well, we weren't the people on the other end using it. So a lot of times we built it for how we thought, not for how our clients or customers thought. So I can see that part of what they were trying to solve, that part of the process. Now, go ahead.
Now, remember, we're talking about software development. We're not
Yes,
talking about manufacturing yet.
right.
We're not talking about traditional projects. So we have to remember that out of World War II, all the auto manufacturers were making their profit on volume. Everybody coming back from the war, having a big influx of money and all that, right?
Yeah.
The problem is W.E. Deming and a few other these quality experts were trying to get the interest of these companies and they wouldn't listen to them in the US. And that's why W.E. Deming responded to the request of MacArthur to help rebuild Japan, to try out his little scientific experiments. And lo and behold, he discovered, and others discovered, that people are willing to spend more money on value than on volume.
Oh
And
yeah, that
all of
and
a sudden, we know this. You and I know this.
we do, yes.
If you don't make something people will use, what's the use of it? And so this was a huge pivot in the 1970s when the Japanese auto manufacturers came to the United States and overtook the industry just overnight.
Well, and it took me, and I got caught up in that because what I found was that as the American manufacturers kind of cheapened their cars, and I think it was volume over value, and the Japanese cars were they were not that expensive, but they were well made. It took me a while to go from those Japanese purchases back to American made because there was that lull in value and that sort of thing. But if
Right,
I
right.
but if I can pick up kind of where I left off first, so from my historical thing where we were the brainiacs and we imposed our solutions on the users, what you described also to me was kind of the best way I can put it into place for our listeners is, well, in my case, the iPhone, but in a lot of other cases, the other kinds of phones, where we end up with features that keep on being added. And so if I look at the development life cycle of an iPhone, it's never ending because the incremental and the iterative, as you described earlier, is there every single month. There's new products, there's new advancements, there's new usability. So I can see the iPhone or other smartphones being a perfect example of what you described as an agile process that just keeps making it better and better, and yet usable in the interim.
You know, and this is what I wanted to get to in manufacturing, because it's this incremental capability of giving some type of functionality early and then building in that incremental functionality. We understood that in software, and now they understand it in manufacturing. Look at the auto manufacturers. You have this new base model, right? Like F-150. And
Yep.
then you have all these different F-150 types that they release month after month and year after year. And this is the mindset of business now. And this is why business is really embracing the agile ability. But the problem is there's something called a mindset. It's not a set of tools that you need to bring to the table. It's that, but it's so much more. It's changing the behavior of a corporation to be able to do the work. And that's where I've seen the implementation of Agile fail most.
Yeah, I've got, in fact, I have a past partner from my from my old consulting days who somehow fell into this process where he goes into corporations and doesn't deal with the IT teams. He deals with the business teams in terms of how to respond to agile development. And so he's actually helping business teams all the way up to the CEO and CIO. Well, not so much the CIO, but the CEO, as to how to have their entire organization kind of fall in place behind any sort of agile, whether it's software development or manufacturing. So I think he somehow found a niche that is absolutely becoming much more prevalent and required in this day and age.
Yes, yes. And this is how all these influencers on YouTube and the guys who write the business books on changing your habits and changing leadership. And this is why leadership is such a big topic, because it's the mindset of how you approach the work. We can talk about this a little bit more if you want, but you can't be a command and control project manager when you're managing Agile. You have to delegate. You cannot, you're not going to have people step up. If you say, this is the way things are going to be, your team is going to say, okay, that's fine. And what you need your teams to do is get in your face and say, this is why we can't do it. And if you want to fail the project, you're doing the exact right thing. And so we're having to deal with humanistic things like confrontation and argument. And this is a natural part of work.
It's interesting in this agile project that I am advising on the project management principles and how to get their stakeholders involved. What I'm watching from the sidelines is people like the Scrum Master and how they run, for example, their morning stand-ups and how they run their retrospectives after they finish a sprint and that sort of thing. So these are kind of new processes to me. But here's, based on what you just talked about, here's what was interesting. One of the things that they do during a retrospective is that they have people write on yellow stickies, if they're the shy types who don't want to kind of reveal their concerns. They write them on a yellow sticky and they paste them on the board anonymously.
Oh,
And
that's
so,
brilliant.
And so in this virtual world, a lot of them can paste them. I'm not sure exactly how they do it anonymously in the virtual world, but basically they get to put their concerns on a board. And let's face it, as a Scrum Master himself pointed out to us, if they have a complaint against me, but are shy about bringing it up, at least this way they can bring it up and have permission to do so without any kind of repercussions for doing it.
That's absolutely brilliant. This actually takes the heat off of the individual, and it moves the problem, the issue, the conflict to where it needs to be focused, where you're solving the problems of the project, not the people.
Well, if I understand team building, over time that will go away because those same shy people will have permission and learn over time that there will be no repercussions for them bringing something like that up, and then they can voice their concerns not anonymously. I think
Beautiful.
I think that all comes into play.
And again, it takes an advanced level of human behavior and understanding of emotional intelligence and self-awareness, everything that you've been talking about.
So it's amazing how much we have put into these podcasts leading up to this point, completely serendipitously. I mean, when we talked about emotional intelligence, when we talked about handling conflict, when we talked about bringing users on board, we never thought ahead to this discussion about Agile. Not in my mind, we didn't.
My question to you is, we're going to have, there's over 1 million people with PMP. We're going to have hundreds of thousands of project managers who are under 10 years as a project manager and don't necessarily have the experience and wisdom that a 20-year or 25-year project manager can handle. How do we prepare these project managers for this type of an onslaught?
Man, that is an excellent, they hire people like you and me, Tim, at our outrageous asking fees to help them. No, I think there is something that IT organizations, whether you're a vendor or an internal department, IT department, I think we need to put away the old days of spending all of our discretionary funds on training and technology and taking some of that and put it into training into people issues, understanding what it means to work with people. You know, we've said this a few times on these podcasts, the soft skills are the hard skills. And sometimes even the soft skills in terms of learning seem to be easy to pick up in learning, but very hard to put into practice unless someone is continuing to coach you. So I think until IT organizations themselves put their money behind the requirement of bringing their, well, right from the team lead all the way up to the project manager to understand the people issues and putting people first, I think it will always be a struggle.
Humans are humans.
Yeah,
That's the one component that you can't remove from the projects.
that's right.
There are a couple other things. Number one, in about 2011, there was a new model of Agile that was released. It was called Scaled Agile. And Scaled Agile says, you know, this organization may not be ready for a full release of Agile. Let's go ahead and just do pieces of it. Instead of having backlogs and features and product backlog items, let's go ahead and just work on self-organizing teams for the next 6 months. And then let's work on servant leadership for the next 6 months. And we can build a platform within which we can actually integrate piecemeal the pieces of Agile that make sense for our organization or our company. Now, this takes strategy. This is not a tactical action. And it takes top-down support, investment, and communication. And so I can see where this is going to be a monumental pivot. I talk to corporations every 3 or 4 months about this topic. How do I find those self-organizing people? How can I hire for them? You know, you don't. You find the people who learn something about responsibility and accountability, and you put them in positions and you support them, and then you learn how to make it very easy for them to pick up the good habits. It's sweeping everything out of the way so they can do the work they need, and giving them enough time to make enough mistakes, not too many, but enough mistakes so they understand not just what and how they're doing this Agile stuff, but why they're doing it. And that's a big part of the learning.
Yeah, and I think that works well for those organizations that have a consistent sort of group of project management staff, IT staff. It probably works a little bit less well for IT vendors, for system integrators who are brought in to do a project, and basically they have a timeline of
Right.
2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, to get this project in from start to finish. And so there's not a lot of time to do a lot of that sort of learning and scaling along the way. You pretty much have to come in with learned people who are experienced in the process to be able to make it happen. So I think depending on the organization, there's different approaches to this.
Yeah, and let me say this also. So yes, and the thing is, there are some investments project by project these type of small implementations can take advantage of. Tools like the team charter and the kickoff, and the ability to say, you know what, we're going to do something here, and here's the benefit of doing it. It's going to be different from the way your organization does it, but we found it works well with 6 of our other clients here, and we want to introduce it. Can we have that as a component of this project? And I've seen a couple companies I worked with that were really successful in this.
And that makes a lot of sense, because after all, if IT people can't stomach change, they shouldn't be in IT. But I like the idea of this whole SAFe process, the scaled, you called scaled agile.
Yeah,
Scaled
it's
agile. Yeah.
scaled agile for enterprise. It used to be called. Now it's
Okay.
just called scaled agile.
Scaled agile. Yeah. It makes sense because it's almost like you're doing agile in an agile way, where you're incrementally introducing agile through the whole entire process.
And that's the key. And from an IT standpoint, that's the way our mind works.
Yeah.
Is it better to approach this as a forklift? Is it better to approach this as piecemeal? And what makes best sense for this project inside this organization?
Or or if you have my experience as a young farm boy of 6 years old, the way I learned to swim was my dad threw me in the deep end of the river, of our swimming area in the river. You learned to swim, or you kind of had a few mouthfuls before he picked you up again.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you don't necessarily want to do it that way. You kind of want to get introduced nicely. And when I say my dad threw me in, he was obviously trying to test me and see how I was, but there was nothing unsafe about it. So I want to alleviate people's minds that way.
Yeah, but you know what? This is, again, one of the things that I've seen Agile respond to is, number one, people have a nature. People are going to do what people do. They argue, they complain, they make mistakes. And instead of us trying to fight that, Agile is saying, why don't we embrace that? Why don't we take advantage of it? And instead of arguing, let's call it debate and put traditional rules around it so that we can choose the best idea. Instead of calling it a mistake, call it an opportunity for improvement and catch it on our retrospectives, and be able to use this so that every ounce of effort, every amount of time, every dollar is spent on moving the project forward and improving the project.
And that makes a lot of sense. So we've kind of looked at, I mean, again, last week was conceptual. This week is a little more to the entire agile process. But we mentioned the word Scrum earlier. And I've also used the word sprint. This is what I'm learning on this project that I'm looking, kind of advising. So there's scrums, there's sprints, there's stand-ups. Is there a way that you might be able to kind of bring some of those concepts into play in terms of where does a sprint fit with a scrum, or where does a stand-up, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So let's do a high level, and then next week we can actually dig into the great details.
All right.
So Scrum, as I learned, was a framework for sharing information. Okay, that's all it was. It was saying, we need to get information to the people who need it quickly, and we need to integrate that quickly into our work, because the work's going to be changing almost on a daily basis, and the stakeholders are going to help us with this. And so that's where Scrum came from. And actually, Scrum represents two things. It represents that daily stand-up at the beginning of the day, 15 minutes, no more, but sharing progress, status, forecast, what are our issues, what are our risks, and it frames the work for the rest of the day, the rest of the time cycle. And you can have a stand-up for each day, you can have a stand-up for each week, it just, depends. And then on the other side of the work, you have something called a retrospective. And that's where you sit down and you relax and you capture your lessons learned, right? What went well? What could we have done better? And if we were to change. Now, sandwiched between those two meetings are cycles. And we may go through iterations many, many times, like that smartphone you're talking about.
Yeah.
It may not be the right shape, or the glass on the smartphone has thumbprints on it after only being touched once by a single person, and they don't like that, right? And so what you're going to do is build a prototype, And it doesn't have to be the whole phone. It could be color swatches, or it could be something on a computer screen or something like that. And those are the prototypes. And you show that to your stakeholders, and you do that on a regular basis, right? And that's called a review.
Hmm.
So you have your stand-up, your iteration review, and you have your retrospectives. And those meetings generate lots and lots and lots of information. Now, go ahead.
And then the sprint, is that so the sprint is the time box period, right? Between kind of planning for it and the retrospective. Is that the idea?
We'll get to sprints in a minute.
Oh, okay.
This is where it gets really interesting, because these meetings we have are the verbs, and the sprints and the work you're talking about is a noun, and they work together. So let's talk more about Scrum. I want to finish up because we've got to tie all this information back together, and that's what we call a Scrum of Scrums. Okay, and a Scrum of Scrums allows you, and it creates a methodology to bring in all of this information. Now, when I say you, it's not the project manager per se who's doing this. It's basically the efforts of the team, the project manager, and other decision makers that bring this back into the items in your work. And the backlog is basically just says, this is the work we're going to do, right? And that's what it does. And it may modify other pieces of the backlog, or they may become their own pieces of backlog. For instance, maybe people say, I would love this phone if it came with a little handle I could put around my wrist that I wouldn't lose the phone, right? That all of a sudden becomes a feature when it's decided there's incredible amount of value for that. And so we get these opportunities to make these really quick changes. Now, this does not mean we get rid of formal change management. It means that this change is shared responsibility, and it's integrated into the way we do our work. We always had it, but we had it as a system, and we really didn't articulate how closely this change was tied to the dynamics of the changing needs and expectations of the organization, the environment, and the users.
Which in the old predictive model was often a problem, because the projects would take 2-3 years. Sometimes change was inevitable just because of the time span that went on. And so you basically introduced extra expense and extra cost to the customer to put in some changes that they never could have anticipated 2 years earlier.
Right.
So with Agile, it seems like you're keeping up with change as you're iteratively going through the process.
Yeah, where you're trying to predict the waves as a surfer in Predictive, and you may be stuck out on a calm ocean by accident. In Agile, you're attempting to stay on top of the waves and continually balance so that the waves can carry you at least as far as you need to go.
Gotcha.
Now, let's talk about sprint. A sprint is a type of time box. Now, we're going to have to get into a little bit of planning, and I want to reserve some of this for next week, but we can talk about it. The problem with with Agile is you don't want to get locked down to how and what early. Now, the training material that people have when they're going through learning this stuff says that the success of a predictive project is adherence to the plan, because I know the work well and we have the plan solid, and that's going to increase project success. In Agile, project success is aligned with the relationships. And that's not Tim saying it. It's not Merv saying it. It's basically what academic material says. This is what makes Agile successful. It's the relationship component. It's how the people work together and talk together and share information and share the work. Now, you don't want to get locked into a set of requirements, because requirements may cause you to go down a path that you don't want to go down to, or a third of the way down that path, you realize you missed a path or missed a piece, and you have to back up and do it again. So what Agile does is attempt to create a structure around an objective and use that structure. Now, they call the pieces of work in Agile features. And sometimes they use the word epics too, and we'll get more into this. It basically means a summary task or a group of work, much like a work package or a planning package may be. Now, because you don't have requirements, your experts are not able to help you estimate, and you don't want them to. The furthest you want them to go is to figure out how complex this is so you can prioritize. And you don't want to prioritize, and you don't want to estimate on durations. So what you estimate on is the complexity and uncertainty, and you can actually measure how complex and how uncertain this is based on the input of your experts. And then with the experts in the teams, they can say this is 3 times as complex as that. So I'm going to give 3 units of complexity over here, and I'm only going to give 1 unit of complexity here. Now, that's going to help you in part of your estimation, because as you get through the work, all of a sudden, you're going to realize this unit of complexity is somewhere between 3 days and 9 days, and you can use that for the rest of your project.
As long as you can continue to take that 3 days and 9 days and reduce it to maybe 4 to 5 days as you become better at it.
So here's the key. As a project manager, a lot of this scheduling and a lot of this budgeting and a lot of this risk analysis, you're going to have to delegate, because this is what working in an unknown state means. Now, let's get back to your sprint. This is where we can start talking about it. You need a baseline. You need some type of benchmark to say, okay, what's our initial estimate, so that we can actually show progress, or we can actually start talking about this. And so they say, we're going to use a time cycle. We'll agree on a regular time cycle for each feature. And usually a time cycle will be between a week and 4 weeks. 2 to 4 weeks is what they call a sprint. And it's basically a time box, and it does 2 things for us. It sets that initial estimation that you can use for a benchmark. And it also creates a sense of urgency, because if you if you have unlimited time, people are not going to get the work done.
Well, and that's what happens in predictive a lot. You look down and you're seeing something 3 years away, and even though it's sliced up into phases and deliverables, you're still looking down. Oh, I can always make up that time, right? So I see what you're saying from
and you need some sense of time, some sense of discipline around how we're going to effectively use our time.
Yeah. Well, okay. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, and then I heard, and at the risk of getting even more detailed into this, but then I also heard the term Kanban boards, it's a Japanese term is that your dashboard basically, this to measure progress?
It's sort of a dashboard. Okay. So let me go and say one more thing about features, and then we'll talk about Kanban. Kanban is really interesting because it comes from Scrum and Lean. One thing about features is they need to be able to stand on their own until they can't. Okay. One of the things that Agile is really not good for is at the beginning of the project, if you see a lot of the work, connecting in complex ways to each other, where you're saying, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this. And you realize that you're managing more of the work than getting the work done, because we have all these relationships and dependencies happening. You might as well just go back to the whiteboard and turn it into a predictive project. And that's basically the prescription there. But you want to have these features, at least in the beginning, be self-standing so that you can actually use them as little tiny pilots within the project for exploration and for work. You can get away with some dependencies and some requirements, and you can move the work around a little bit to do that. But for the most part, it works best when these features and these pieces of work are not working together.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense to me, having worked in a lot of client organizations where subject matter experts and end users who are kind of loaned to your projects typically have day jobs. So if you can work on a feature that can stand alone, you don't need all of the subject matter experts in the sprint, if I got that right, in the sprint at the same time. You can just pull those in for that feature. And then when you're working on the next feature, you can get other users, but as long as you connect everything at some point so that every subject matter expert or end user knows kind of where they fit in the big picture.
And it's brilliant when you can do this, because this is called flow-based Agile. Not only can you do this type of work in the manner you talked about, but you can actually, excuse me, look at the resources and say, you know what? Let's just grab a piece of work from the top, and when you're done, go to the next piece and the next piece. This is really good in software development, where you have a lot of libraries that you're all developing, or pieces of the code that you're all working on. And the integration you still have to consider, but for the most part, the pieces themselves can be treated as their own things. Now, the other part that's not flow-based is what we call iteration with a backlog, which we've been talking about. You release the basic phone, and then you release the phone with its enhanced capabilities, and then more capabilities and more capabilities. So you have those two types of Agile.
So where does the Kanban board come in now? The Kanban board, that's hard to say.
So we have these features, right? Let's call them summary tasks.
All right.
Now, imagine, if you can, I'm going to have a board with a bunch of sticky notes, and I'm going to have these tasks moving through certain parts, like in a software development project. I'll have the code development, I'll have the code test, I'll have the code validation, and I'll have the code implementation, okay? And then I can say, let's only allow 2 to 3 for validation. And so as soon as they're validated, we're going to move them over for implement, and they're going to immediately go out. And then I can actually say the amount of features or tasks that I move into the input of my Kanban, I'm going to equal the velocity and the volume, or the throughput, of the tasks moving out. So I'm creating a very predictable flow, and we can start using true systems analysis on managing this flow. This is great. Manufacturing just fell over and fell in love with this mindset, because what they did was they said, okay, the amount of Cheerios that people are buying from us, let's buy the same amount of raw material. And when the volume of sold drops down, we'll drop down the volume of raw material. And so the Kanban was seen as a good way of right-sizing the volume of materials. And it created the mindset of just-in-time manufacturing. Now, to go back to projects, it's not just that. It's actually saying, if I have a complex set of things that my tasks are going through, I can easily apply root cause analysis if I have a predictable flow in my process.
Interesting. And I suspect also if you can do these standalone features, that you can have several parallel scrums or sprints going on, so that you can enhance your predictability of getting done sooner, because there's a lot of now, yes, there is the integration piece later on where you have to bring the pieces together. But I can see where you can do this in parallel and have several teams working in concert, and then they all come together at one time. Is that, am I getting that right?
That's exactly right. Now, what's neat is you can upscale this and take it into program management. And this is what I did with the company I was a part owner of. We had one thing and one thing alone we did for a couple years, right? We upgraded cell towers, and that was our project. And from a program management standpoint, we were also agile. So each one of these tasks was a project in its own. And we could actually move the tasks through the Kanban and say, okay, we're putting out this much of the work, and it seems like when 70% of the work is done, that other 30% can take us this much time, and here's the risk. And so we can start planning and accepting work, and it balanced our operations and our cash flow like crazy.
Well, that and that, when you're starting out, that makes a whole lot of difference in whether or not you're going to be viable after some time.
And you know what? We can actually apply these tools inside of a 2 to 6 week projects and still get value.
Yeah. So let's go kind of get away from a little bit of the detail now. I think those pieces of information in terms of what the Agile process means are good. What if we looked at some of the, and I know there's this thing called the Agile Manifesto.
Mm-hmm.
When I was reading through it, one of the things that caught my eye was that the Agile process, or the Agile thoughts around how to produce systems, kind of dealt with working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, I come from those large systems where documentation was everything. If you didn't document it, how do you maintain it? So can you kind of shed some light on what that means, working software over comprehensive documentation?
And it's not a binary. It's not saying that we devalue documentation. It says that documentation has a lower priority to working software. And if you step back and think about projects and project management, you have to agree with that. If a deliverable does not function, your project has failed. And no matter how shiny your documentation is, a non-functional deliverable has failed your project. But if you go the reverse, there is a spectrum of failure all of a sudden with the level of detail or the quality of documentation. So from that argument alone, we can actually find a point where we can agree with that statement no matter who we are.
Yeah. The other thought I had was, you mentioned requirements earlier, that we don't focus in Agile on requirements. We focus on self-managing teams, working teams that kind of go through and develop these features as they understand them within the confines of those time boxes. But think about that. So what is the leap from bad requirements that caused failed predictive projects to this new process, and how they sort of get away from handling bad requirements? I mean, not handling, but how they get away from bad requirements altogether.
So let's borrow a model from business, okay? Objectives. There always has to be a why of a project. Nobody's going to invest in a project without a good why. we need this new system because it's going to open up a new market. It's going to fix the problems we have on our network. It's going to build a new facility for the growth that we'll need for the next 15 years. These are what we call our objectives, or why we need the project. What Agile says is, it's not that we're ignoring requirements. It's we're deferring requirements, and we're making sure that everybody in the room is focused tightly on the why. And if they have a better way to reach that why, we need to have them speak up.
Yeah.
And so,
go ahead.
And that's it's a pivot point. It's saying, we're objective focused. Every effort, every person, every dollar spent is answering in a better way we can reach to that why.
Well, and here's the beautiful part of that, coming again from waterfall predictive. It's amazing how often I was in a situation where the requirements obviously were put together beforehand so that you could create your project charter, or so that you could create an RFP to bid to. And then you brought new people onto the project from who did not put those original requirements together, but who may have been brought from the working ranks, right? And they've been loaned to your project. And they look at the requirements and they go, that doesn't make sense. That's not how I do my job. And then you get this confusion. But I can see in the Agile process where you bring people together and you collaborate as you go along, and you understand both from a system perspective and a business perspective what is needed in terms of the objective of the feature, then it just makes a whole lot more sense that you're going to build what the customer wants.
Yes, but there's a problem.
Another problem.
It's called human nature.
Yeah.
Let's suppose my favorite project, let's suppose that we're going to build a box, and that box is going to cover the switch of a tool, because every time you move the tool, it turns the tool on, and it's a safety risk. So you're going to build a box around it. So you go to your stakeholders and you say, describe this box. What does it do for you? Human nature says, this box needs to be black. This box needs to be 20 by 20 by 20 centimeters. And you say, that's a requirement. I don't need that. Talk to me about what you need and why you need it. This is the hardest thing in the world, to number one, to get people to talk about objectives, needs, and expectations without requirements. And number two, to learn how to elicit these objectives, needs, and expectations without asking for requirements. And there's a whole bunch of tricks that Agile puts together. Say, here's a really neat way to do that. But people are focused on describing nouns and verbs, and they have a real hard time, or the culture doesn't allow them to talk about what they need and what they expect. So again, we're talking about a change in mindset. We're not just talking about using a set of new fancy tools.
And that's perfect. The other side that I've seen, again, on these long projects, is priorities may change. You may get a new CEO. You may get a new department head. You may get new legislation, and suddenly
you will. you will.
Yeah. So in the Agile process, what I'm gleaning from this is that because the sprints are 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and so you can only do a certain amount of feature building in that short amount of time, that if you are releasing incremental change to production, you're not releasing this entire process that when it gets changed, you have to backtrack and restart parts of it. You're basically tweaking the last thing you might have put in. So you don't have as much at risk or much at stake, from what I'm understanding, in terms of if a priority or a legislative change comes in, you're not rebuilding from scratch necessarily. You're picking up from where you left off.
Let me give you another example.
Yeah.
Let's just pretend for a moment a pandemic hits the planet and everybody on the planet is in lockdown and your project must continue. How are you going to pivot and be able to get your team together to figure out the best tools to use, the best way to get the work done, and the best way to communicate? Right? Are
Does
you
that
going to
ever
give them a
happen?
tool? Huh?
Does
Is that
that
ever?
ever happen?
Oh, this we went through that Petri dish. Everybody on the planet went through it the
Yeah.
last 18 months, and we know how human nature solves it, and that's how Agile likes to solve things too. You find a few people who are exploring different solutions for communications and different solutions for, shared documentation and version control. And they play with different versions and they emerge together, finding out best of breed, and everybody adopts that real quickly. That's Agile.
Well, I'm almost convinced that I should become an Agile expert in project management.
You don't have to be. Well, let me put it this way. It's really strange that Agile seems to be founded in human nature. And you, because you've been working for 20 to 25 years with human nature in business, are well equipped to adopt these Agile skills. This is what you and I have been talking about. I've been observing you and listening to you, and you already have a lot of the mindset. It's the terms and the concepts, I think, that we need to, you know, get into people's hands quicker. And those are the pieces that I'm excited about.
Well, I think part of that learning came from just observing projects. And I don't know that I've ever been on a project that truly, truly failed. That is, it did not meet its objectives. Now, I have been on projects that perhaps came in a little late or didn't meet every single objective, but nonetheless were implemented in a worthwhile way. But from those, I would often go back with my team or even by myself, kind of think, what could we have done better? And it always, every single time, it came down to the fact that it wasn't the technology that failed us. It wasn't the Gantt charts that failed us. It wasn't the process that failed us. It was our ability to deal with people, and not even just deal with them, but to use them in a way that helped us get across the finish line in a much more objective manner that was much more pleasing to our client. And so I can see that Agile is bringing all of that into play.
And this is so exciting right now because, number one, from a business standpoint, we've had a perfect storm of the reason to adapt Agile in many ways, in breakthroughs in neurobiology and understanding human behavior for the last 20 years. We know so much more about how to help people change their habits, adopt good habits, and de-adopt bad habits. And so we're going to see a huge growth in understanding and mastery of this, and you're going to be in a front seat watching this. And that's the final thing I want to leave us with. This is not something you learn in class, and it's not something you learn in a book. You learn by observing and being around it. So if there's any advice that I can give anybody who's interested in exploring Agile, find out where Agile is being discussed, find out where Agile is being performed, watch, observe, ask questions. Even if they think that you're bothering them, get those answers and learn why, not just the how and the what.
Well, and I'm also thinking that watching an Agile process in play, there is no one right answer. It's a very flexible approach, well, I think you called it adaptive
Right.
methodology. And it is, you adapt as you go along because every team is different. Every client is different. Every objective that you're trying to meet is different. And so therefore, if you can adapt this collaborative approach to the challenge at hand to come up with that optimum solution, I think it all comes down to there is no right answer, but there is an answer, and it becomes something that you build into your experience. And as you work with your teams, it just makes a whole lot of sense that you move forward with this process.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I think that's our time, Tim. This has been enlightening.
Oh yeah. And you know what? Let's have one more week on this, because I'd like you and me to have a discussion of what does it look like to plan Agile, to do Agile, and monitor and control Agile. And if I can, between now and next week, let's you and me put our heads around how we can have that discussion.
That makes sense. So Tim Jerome or Timothy Jerome on LinkedIn.
That's me. That's me.
Merv Jersak on LinkedIn, and we will see you next week.
Thanks again. Thanks, everyone.